El Reno is not just another tornado story. It's the day the sky turned into a predator, and the hunters became the hunted. Everyone who studies storms knows the name. Most people have no idea what actually happened out there. Here is a fact that should startle you. The widest tornado ever recorded on planet Earth is officially filed away as a mundane, everyday EF3. Not an EF5, not the top of the scale, an EF3. Sound wrong to you? It should. Because for a few terrifying minutes on May 31st, 2013, this thing behaved like nothing science had ever tracked before. And then it went and erased its own proof by tearing through empty wheat fields instead of towns. Stick around, because the reason for that downgrade is going to make you furious. Let's set the scene, because the atmosphere that afternoon was loaded like a gun. Canadian County, Oklahoma, late May. The kind of humid, electric air that storm chasers dream about and farmers dread. Meteorologists measured the available energy in the atmosphere that day at over 5,000 joules per kilogram. That number alone told experienced chasers something monstrous was brewing. Not a shower, not a normal supercell, a machine built to produce something historic. And shortly after 6 o'clock that evening, it did. At 6:03 p.m., Central Time, a tornado touched down. Within minutes, it wasn't behaving like a typical funnel at all. It was swelling, expanding outward in every direction like something feeding. Chasers who had seen hundreds of tornadoes across their careers watched their instruments and just went quiet. That silence is the sound of professionals realizing they're out of their depth, and the storm hadn't even reached its worst version of itself yet. If a tornado hunting the hunter sounds bizarre, subscribe now, because this story only gets more extraordinary from here. By the time it crossed US Route 81, the tornado had grown into something that shouldn't exist outside of a nightmare. 2.6 miles wide. Read that again. 2.6 miles of destructive rotating wind, wider than most towns, wider than entire neighborhoods stacked end to end. It remains the widest tornado ever documented anywhere on Earth. Not close, not debated. The record. And it wasn't a slow, lumbering giant either. This thing moved, shifted, and changed shape by the second, which is exactly what made it so lethal to everyone trying to study it from the ground. Here's where the science gets almost impossible to believe. The University of Oklahoma deployed a mobile radar system called Raxpol, and what it captured inside small spinning sub-vortices orbiting the main funnel was unprecedented. 313 miles per hour. That's a radar-estimated wind velocity, measured close to the ground at under 10 meters altitude, and it stands as the second highest wind speed ever recorded on this planet. Not the storm's overall wind. A vortex within the vortex. A tornado spinning inside a tornado. How do you even prepare for that? You don't! Now you need to understand who was actually out there chasing this thing. Because this wasn't reckless amateurs looking for a thrill. TWISTEX was a research team built around one purpose: getting scientific instruments close enough to a tornado to learn something that could save lives. Tim Samaras led it. 55 years old, an engineer with a reputation for calculated risk, not blind risk. His son Paul, 24, rode along as the team's photographer. Carl Young, 45, brought the meteorology expertise. These three men had chased storms together for years. They knew exactly what they were doing. That's what makes what happened next so brutal. In their final recorded moments, sitting in their vehicle as the wall of the storm grew in front of them, Tim Samaras can be heard saying it plainly. Actually, I think we're in a bad spot. No panic in his voice yet. Just recognition. The recognition of a man who had spent his life reading storms and understood in that instant that this one had outgrown every probe and instrument he'd ever designed. Carl Young kept filming. Paul kept his camera up. 3 experienced men doing their jobs. Inside a car that was about to become part of the story instead of documenting it. If this is landing hard, tap like right now. It genuinely helps this story reach the people who've never heard it. El Reno was lethal not only for its size, but also for its speed. Smaller vortices circling the outer edge of the main tornado, sometimes called satellite vortices, were clocked moving across the ground at 175 miles per hour. Think about that for a second. That's faster than most highway traffic could ever hope to escape. Roads around the storm turned into gridlock within minutes, chasers and locals alike stacked bumper to bumper, trying to outrun something that could simply reroute itself faster than any car could react. The tornado was both large and actively unpredictable, shifting direction without warning, and that unpredictability is what turned an already historic storm into a trap. Richard Henderson wasn't a professional. He was 35 years old, a local resident with a passion for storms, chasing on his own in a pickup truck. At 6:05 p.m., he snapped a photo of the black wall of wind bearing down on him and sent it to his friend, George "Sonny" Slay. While talking to him on the phone, Henderson told Slay he was having fun. Read that again. A man having the time of his life, minutes from tragedy, with no way at all to know it. 10 minutes into their continuous call, Henderson was still talking to Slay when his voice suddenly changed. "It's debris hitting my pickup," he said. Then a loud popping noise. After a brief exchange about the debris, the line went dead, and it never reconnected. That silence on the other end of a phone call is one of the most haunting details in this entire event. One moment, a man having fun. The next, gone. Back inside the TWISTEX vehicle, a stock, unmodified white sedan with zero armor plating and zero special reinforcement, the storm made its final move. A sub-vortex, one of those satellite spin-ups rotating faster than anything on the main structure, struck the car directly. The impact was so severe that it threw Paul Samaras and Carl Young more than 100 yards from the wreckage. Tim Samaras was discovered still strapped into the passenger seat, inside what remained of the mangled vehicle. Three men who had spent their careers studying nature's most violent phenomenon were killed by the exact force they devoted their lives to understanding. That's not irony, that's tragedy, plain and simple. 8 people died because of the El Reno tornado. 8, not dozens, despite what internet rumors love to claim. All 8 were inside vehicles when they were struck. 3 were professional researchers. 1 was an amateur enthusiast, Richard Henderson. The remaining 4 were motorists, simply caught on the road at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place, on the worst possible day. Every single fatality happened inside a car. That detail alone should tell you everything about how this storm behaved. Low to the ground, fast-moving, and merciless toward anything on wheels. The tornado stayed on the ground for exactly 40 minutes, carving a path 16.2 miles long across Canadian County. 40 minutes. That's less time than most people spend scrolling through their phone before bed. And in that window, it became the widest tornado ever measured, killed 8 people, and generated wind estimates that rank among the fastest ever recorded anywhere on the planet. How does something that brief become that historic? That's the question that should stay with you. Now here's the part that should genuinely make you angry. In August of 2013, months after the disaster, the National Weather Service officially downgraded El Reno's rating. It had briefly carried an EF5 classification based on radar data, the highest possible rank on the tornado scale. But the final, permanent rating landed at EF3. Why? Because the rating system judges tornadoes by the damage they leave behind on buildings and structures. And El Reno spent most of its life crossing open farmland instead of towns. The radar proved historic winds. The wheat fields simply couldn't record them the same way a house could. So a storm capable of 313-mile-an-hour gusts sits on paper looking almost ordinary. That's either a flaw in the system or a warning we haven't fully learned from. Maybe both. This event changed how storm chasing works permanently, Researchers and hobbyists alike started talking openly about the risks of getting close to storms that don't behave predictably anymore. TWISTEX's own tragedy became a case study, discussed at meteorology conferences and safety briefings for years afterward. The community didn't stop chasing. It couldn't. But it started respecting distance differently. Understanding that experience and instinct aren't guarantees against a tornado that can rewrite its own rules mid-formation. Reno didn't just kill 8 people. It forced an entire field of science to admit how much it still didn't know. In June of 2026, 13 years after that afternoon, community members, meteorologists, and chasers gathered again at the memorial site in Canadian County. They came to honor Tim Samaras, Paul Samaras, Carl Young, and Richard Henderson, along with the 4 other lives lost that day. Storms fade from headlines fast. This one hasn't. Every anniversary, people return to that stretch of Oklahoma ground and remember that the widest tornado in recorded history wasn't a statistic. It was a Friday evening that turned into the last evening for 8 families. So the next time someone tells you a storm is just an EF3, remember this name. Remember 2.6 miles wide. Remember 3 men who studied tornadoes for a living and still couldn't outrun the one that finally caught them. Nature doesn't care about your experience, your equipment, or your reputation. It never has. Reno proved that in 40 minutes flat, and it's still proving it every single anniversary since. If this story stayed with you, like it and subscribe, because there are more true events out there just as memorable as this one.